The Cold War Explained. 1945. 1991. A Complete History Overview. Welcome back. Today, I'm not just sharing another history video, I'm sharing a journey through English itself. Every word I speak, every story I tell, carries echoes of the past, echoes of people, of moments, of voices that shaped our world. So don't just listen to practice English. Listen to feel. Silence the noise around you, and let the language draw you in, back to the very beginning. And if you'd like to return anytime, please subscribe so this journey is always waiting for you. The Dawn of the Bipolar World, 1945. 1949. A victory tarnished by division. The Second World War in Europe had concluded, and the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom stood victorious as the leading Allied powers. Yet, the fragile unity forged in the crucible of war quickly dissolved under the pressure of determining Europe's future. In a brief, symbolic moment on the 12th of August, 1945, American General and Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower attended a massive Soviet athletics parade in Moscow. He stood beside Joseph Stalin, witnessing over 20 different performances for nearly 4.5 hours. This short post-surrender window was the last breath of Allied camaraderie, before the narrative shifted irrevocably from friendship to rivalry and ultimately, conflict. The main point of contention was the vision for a post-war Europe. The United States and Britain championed the principle of free elections and the establishment of democratic governments in territories formerly occupied by Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union, however, had a different objective: to carve out a secure sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, establishing a chain of communist-friendly regimes and buffer states against the capitalist West. The rise of the Eastern Bloc at R. By the close of 1945, the Soviet strategy was visibly taking shape. Communist governments, operating under Moscow's control, were being swiftly installed. By 1947, nations including Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and Hungary were firmly under the control of single-party communist rule. Czechoslovakia, which had enjoyed a democratic tradition before the war, held out slightly longer. But in 1948, a critical event known as the Prague coup saw communists led by Clement Gottwald seize power, ending the nation's fragile democracy. An exception to Soviet dominance emerged in Yugoslavia. Here, the communists under Josip Broz Tito had earned immense popularity by spearheading a formidable resistance movement against the Nazis. Tito's regime secured power independently, without the direct intervention of the Soviet military. Crucially, Tito later orchestrated a historic break from Stalin, resulting in Yugoslavia becoming the only communist state in Europe to remain unaligned with the Soviet Union. Tito's system differed significantly from Stalin's highly centralized, totalitarian state. It was based on worker self-management and a commune system, holding closer to earlier Marxist-Leninist ideals. Stalin, furious at this defiance, prepared for an invasion. However, Tito strategically positioned himself to receive economic and military aid from the West, while maintaining widespread popularity at home. With his other satellite states firmly in place, acting as vital buffers, Stalin chose to wait, anticipating a future economic downturn in the West that would facilitate the further spread of communism. The stark division of the continent was famously articulated by Winston Churchill in his Iron Curtain speech delivered in Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946. He declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, separating the Western democratic states from the communist-controlled East. Though Churchill was no longer prime minister, Stalin viewed the speech as a deeply hostile declaration. The first crises, Iran and Greece. The initial flashpoints of the burgeoning Cold War appeared not in the heart of Europe but on its periphery, starting with the Middle East. During the war, British, Soviet, and later American troops had occupied Iran to secure the rich oil fields and protect the Persian corridor supply route. Following the war, British and American forces withdrew as agreed. However, Soviet troops lingered in northern Iran past the agreed deadline in March 1946. The Soviets not only maintained their presence near the border but actively backed separatist movements, leading to the creation of two puppet states, one Azerbaijani and one Kurdish, within Iranian territory. The West viewed this as a clear violation of Iranian sovereignty and a move to expand Soviet influence. Backed by the United States, Iran appealed to the newly established United Nations, UN. Under this international pressure, the Soviets eventually withdrew their troops that spring, and the puppet states quickly collapsed. The crisis in Iran was a clear foreshadowing of the global ideological conflict to come. The second significant flashpoint ignited in Greece. The Greek monarchy, historically supported by Britain, faced a resurgent communist uprising after the war, plunging the country into a civil war. The Greek communists received support from Albania and Tito's Yugoslavia, who harbored ambitions for a larger Balkan federation. By 1947, the United Kingdom, economically depleted by the costs of the Second World War, announced it could no longer sustain the Greek government with military and economic aid. Fearing that a communist victory in Greece would open the door for Soviet expansion into the Mediterranean and Middle East, the United States stepped in. The Doctrine of Containment. On the 12th of March, 1947, President Harry S. Truman delivered a consequential address, outlining what became known as the Truman Doctrine. He stated the need for the U.S. to provide support to Greece and Turkey, declaring, "We are the only country able to provide that help." This doctrine was a watershed moment, a declaration that the United States would furnish political, military, and economic assistance to any nation threatened by communist expansion. Greece and Turkey were the first beneficiaries, with Greece becoming a crucial frontline state. The Truman Doctrine is widely regarded as the official beginning of the Cold War. It formalized the overarching American strategy of containment, which aimed to stop the spread of communism but not actively seek to overthrow existing communist regimes. Following Tito's split with Stalin and increased American aid, the Greek communists were suppressed, ensuring the royal government remained aligned with the Western democracies. Soon after, the U.S. introduced the European Recovery Program, universally known as the Marshall Plan, named after Secretary of State George C. Marshall. This comprehensive plan called for the massive economic rebuilding of Europe, offering over $13.3 billion in aid, the equivalent of over $173 billion today, to all European countries willing to cooperate. Regardless of political alignment, the core idea was that a prosperous, economically stable Europe would be inherently resistant to the influence of communism and Soviet control, while also serving as a valuable trading partner for the United States. Stalin condemned the Marshall Plan as an act of Western imperialism, compelling communist parties in the West and his satellite states to reject the aid. This decision irrevocably cemented the deep economic and political division between the East and West, the Berlin blockade and the two Germanys. The future of Germany became the most dangerous flashpoint. After the war, Germany was carved into 4 occupation zones controlled by the U.S., the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Berlin, the capital situated deep within the Soviet zone, was similarly divided into corresponding sectors. The Western Allies sought to rebuild and establish a democratic, economically integrated West Germany, while the Soviets aimed to keep Germany weak and under communist influence. By 1947, the Western Allies began moving to merge their sectors economically and politically. In retaliation for a Western currency reform and broader integration efforts, Joseph Stalin ordered the blockade of all land and water routes into West Berlin on the 24th of June, 1948. The goal was to starve the city and force the Western Allies to abandon West Berlin, thus bringing the entire city under Soviet control. Instead of retreating, the Western Allies, led by the U.S. and Britain, launched the monumental Berlin Airlift. Beginning just 2 days after the blockade, Western aircraft made over 277,000 flights over 11 months, delivering more than 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, and essential supplies. At its peak, planes were landing every few minutes. The airlift successfully kept West Berlin supplied, utterly undermining Stalin's strategy. Unable to stop the operation without risking direct military conflict, the Soviets finally conceded defeat. On the 12th of May, 1949, after nearly a year, the Soviets lifted the blockade. This failure was a major political and psychological victory for the West. By 1949, the Western zones merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, a democratic capitalist state. Months later, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was established in the Soviet-aligned East and Jorm. Berlin, precariously isolated within East Germany, remained divided. This same year, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its own nuclear bomb, dramatically escalating tensions between the capitalist and socialist blocs. The new alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The division of the world solidified with the formation of opposing military alliances. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established in response to growing fears of Soviet expansionism. The 12 founding signatories, including the United States, Canada, and the major Western European powers, agreed to a principle of mutual assistance. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. Greece and Turkey later joined, and significantly, West Germany was included in 1955. In the East, the Soviets had earlier formed the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMCON, in response to the Marshall Plan, cementing an economic alliance with its satellite states. Then, in reaction to NATO and West Germany's inclusion, the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies formed a defensive military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. Signed in 1955, its 8 founding members included the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, and others. The Warsaw Pact served as a counterweight, solidifying the Soviet view of NATO as a direct military threat to its security in Eastern Europe. The conflict extends to Asia. 1949, 1954. The Chinese Civil War. The Cold War was not confined to a single continent. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, China was plunged back into a devastating civil war that had originally begun in the 1920 seconds between the nationalists, KMT, and the communists, CCP. The nationalist government Kuomintang, KMT, under Chiang Kai-shek, was reinstalled in the capital of Nanking, controlling major cities, industrial areas, and much of the military infrastructure. The KMT received significant U.S. aid, but its government was plagued by rampant corruption, economic mismanagement, and hyperinflation, alienating vast segments of the Chinese population. In contrast, the communists, CCP, led by Mao Zedong, possessed key strategic advantages. They had strong peasant support through the mass line methodology, vast experience in guerrilla warfare, and access to former Japanese weapons in Manchuria, which had been occupied by the Soviets. The CCP gained widespread support by promising essential land reform and offering a clean alternative to the perceived corruption of the nationalists. In 1947, the tide decisively turned in favor of the CCP. Their army, renamed the People's Liberation Army, PLA, launched 3 major campaigns over the next year that sealed the KMT's fate. The Liaoshen Campaign. The CCP defeated KMT forces and secured control of Manchuria. The Pingjin Campaign. The CCP captured Beijing and the North China Plain. The Huaihai Campaign. By mid-January 1949, the PLA had extended its territory to the Yangtze River, the last major natural barrier protecting the nationalist capital. In mid-April 1949, the PLA launched a massive assault across the river and advanced on Nanking, which fell on the 23rd of April. By this time, Chiang Kai-shek and his government had already fled, first to Guangzhou and eventually relocating to Taiwan. By May, the PLA had taken Shanghai, welcomed by many who saw them as liberators. The stunning speed of this collapse sent shockwaves across the United States. President Harry S. Truman publicly placed the blame on Chiang Kai-shek for the nationalist failure. Conversely, Republicans directed their criticism inward, blaming the late President Franklin D. Roosevelt for granting the Soviets access to Manchuria. which they claimed enabled the Chinese Communists to gain a vital foothold. An even more intense blame game was ignited by Republican Senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy. His unsupported claims that the U.S. government was thoroughly infiltrated by communist agents triggered a period of intense national hysteria known as the Red Scare. This era saw widespread fear of communism and Soviet influence, leading to intense political repression, investigations, and accusations of subversion and disloyalty across American institutions. Despite the accusations, the United States had no proven role in the PLA's victory, and even the Soviet Union had provided only limited assistance to Mao's cause. Nonetheless, in the atmosphere of McCarthyism and heightened threat perception, the Truman administration drafted NSC 68, a top-secret policy paper. This document called for a massive expansion of the military budget, a bolstering of U.S. allies, and the urgent development of the hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon exponentially more powerful than the atomic bomb. This confirmed that the policy of containment seen in Europe was now fully implemented in East Asia. A new power rises. The People's Republic of China. On the 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong formally proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, PRC, in Beijing, marking the communist victory in the Civil War. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist remnants maintained the claim that the Republic of China, ROC, was the legitimate government of all China, though in practice, the ROC only controlled Taiwan and a few surrounding islands. On the mainland, Mao and the CCP established a powerful communist state with a strong central government. Determined to erase the century of humiliation stretching back to the First Opium War in 1839, they sought to reassert China's sovereignty. This meant reclaiming control over border regions like Tibet and Xinjiang. British Hong Kong and Portuguese Macau were also considered Chinese territory, but their return would not occur until later in the century. The most sensitive and significant territory was Taiwan, where the KMT resided. The PRC considered military action to reclaim the island but was swiftly deterred by the United States, which has since maintained military and economic support for Taiwan, effectively preventing the CCP from taking the island by force. China, however, was determined to reassert its influence in two regions historically within its tributary sphere: Vietnam to the south, then a French colony, and Korea to the north. War on the Peninsula. Korea had been annexed into the Japanese Empire in 1910. After Japan's defeat in the Second World War, Korea was temporarily divided at the 38th parallel, occupied by the Soviet Union in the north and the United States in the south, pending elections for a unified government. As U.S. and Soviet relations crumbled, so did the prospect of unification. The Soviet-occupied zone established a communist government under Kim Il-sung, while a capitalist-friendly government emerged in the American zone. Neither side expected the division to last. Kim Il-sung, aiming to unify the peninsula by force, sought aid from the Soviets. Stalin, though supportive of communist expansion, remained cautious of a direct confrontation with the United States. Soviet aid was thus limited to advising, equipment, and Soviet pilots who were required to fly under the North Korean flag. The Korean War began on the 25th of June, 1950, when the Korean People's Army, KPA, launched a surprise invasion across the 38th parallel into South Korea. Equipped with Soviet tanks, artillery, and air support, the KPA quickly overwhelmed the unprepared South Korean army, capturing the capital, Seoul, within 3 days. By September 1950, North Korean forces had pushed the defending South Korean and newly arrived U.S. forces, operating under a United Nations resolution, all the way to the Pusan perimeter, a small corner in the southeast of the peninsula. South Korea was on the brink of collapse. On the 15th of September, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the UN forces, executed a daring and successful amphibious landing at Incheon, near Seoul. This landing caught the North Koreans completely by surprise, cutting off their supply lines. Following this success, Seoul was recaptured by late September, and the UN coalition began a rapid counter-offensive, pushing the North Korean forces northward. Emboldened, the U.S.-led coalition pressed on, crossing the 38th parallel and seeking to unify the entire peninsula under non-communist leadership. By mid-October, UN forces captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and advanced rapidly toward the Yalu River, which borders China. China intervenes. Concerned that the UN forces were nearing its border, China stepped in. On the 19th of October, 1,950 Chinese troops, operating under the banner of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, CPVA, crossed the Yalu River. Initially, their presence was concealed by guerrilla tactics. By late November, the Chinese launched a massive, overwhelming counteroffensive, forcing a rapid and desperate UN retreat that turned the tide of the war once again. By December, UN forces were pushed back beyond the 38th parallel, and Seoul was recaptured by Chinese and North Korean forces in January 1951. MacArthur's aggressive demeanor advocating a full-scale invasion into China and the potential use of nuclear attacks put him at odds with President Truman's containment policy. Truman subsequently relieved him, stating he had considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. MacArthur was replaced by General Matthew Ridgway, who eventually recaptured Seoul in March. By mid-1951, the war settled into a brutal stalemate. The front line stabilized near the 38th parallel, where the conflict had originally begun, as neither side could make significant gains. The war devolved into a prolonged period of trench warfare and small-scale battles, reminiscent of the First World War, with the front lines barely moving from mid-1951 to mid-1953. On the 27th of July, 1953, after 2 years of negotiations, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom, ending active combat. The armistice established the Demilitarized Zone (DMZ), a heavily fortified buffer area roughly along the 38th parallel. A formal peace treaty was never signed, meaning North Korea and South Korea technically remain in a state of war to this day. From the CCP's perspective, China's involvement was necessary to prevent an American allied state from sitting on its border. However, the war demonstrated to the U.S. that Mao was determined to expand communism across Asia, leading to China's isolation by the Western powers and cementing its sole reliance on the Soviet Union for aid. The First Indochina War. The Cold War conflict immediately shifted to Vietnam. This region had also been occupied by the Japanese during the Second World War. Like in China, the Vietnamese resistance was initially forged from a nationalist and communist alliance. But here, the communists took the lead. Ho Chi Minh, a staunch Marxist and anti-colonialist, declared Vietnamese independence in Hanoi shortly after Japan's surrender during the August Revolution, establishing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. However, the French, who had colonized this region as French Indochina, sought to re-establish control. Initial negotiations between France and the Viet Minh broke down, as French leaders were unwilling to grant full independence. Tensions escalated into full-scale conflict by late 1946 after the French bombardment of Haiphong in November, which killed thousands of Vietnamese civilians. The French captured Hanoi and the Viet Minh forces withdrew to the mountains and countryside. The Viet Minh, under the brilliant military leadership of General Von Nguyen Giap, employed effective guerrilla tactics against French supply lines and patrols. The French military, stationed primarily in urban centers, struggled against an enemy familiar with the difficult terrain and enjoying extensive support among the Vietnamese peasantry. The fall of Dien Bien Phu. The CCP's victory in 1949 gave the Viet Minh a powerful ally on their northern border. China provided them with crucial weapons, supplies, and training, transforming their forces into a more organized, better-armed army capable of conventional warfare. As the anti-colonial struggle became a front in the broader Cold War, the United States began providing significant economic and military aid to the French in an effort to contain the spread of communism. The war dragged on as the French found themselves bogged down. Desperate to lure the Viet Minh into a decisive, set-piece battle, the French established a heavily fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, in a remote valley of northern Vietnam. They believed their superior firepower could destroy the Viet Minh forces there. General Giap, however, orchestrated an extraordinary logistical effort, utilizing thousands of laborers and pack animals to transport heavy artillery piece by piece into the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu. From this high ground, the Viet Minh were able to surround and fire down upon the French positions. The resulting siege overwhelmed the French troops over 55 days. Despite French air support and reinforcements, Dien Bien Phu fell on the 7th of May, 1954, marking a decisive defeat for France and the end of their military presence in Indochina. In the aftermath, the Geneva Accords were signed in Switzerland in July 1954. The Accords marked the end of French colonial rule, granted independence to Laos and Cambodia as neutral kingdoms, and temporarily divided Vietnam. At the 17th parallel, the Viet Minh controlled the north, and a non-communist government controlled the south. The pivotal 1950s. Détente and escalation. A change of guard in Moscow. While the conflict in Southeast Asia was temporarily contained, a seismic shift was occurring in the leadership of the Soviet Union, signaling the start of a new, volatile era in Europe. The Geneva Accords had temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, establishing a non-communist government in the south under Ngo Dinh Diem. The accord called for national elections in 1956 to reunify the country. Yet these elections were ultimately never held, foreshadowing further conflict. Meanwhile, in Europe, a seismic shift occurred in 1953 that proved pivotal to the entire Cold War. Joseph Stalin died at the age of 74, officially from a stroke. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, ushered in an era of peaceful coexistence with the West. Khrushchev initiated de-Stalinization, reducing defense spending, and even negotiated the withdrawal of Western Allied troops from Austria, creating a neutral state in the heart of Europe. However, the rigid control over the Soviet satellite states remained a source of deep instability. These nations, governed by dictatorships that mirrored Stalin's iron fist, prioritized heavy industry over consumer goods, a continuation of the five-year plans. Workers faced severe food shortages and wage cuts, which ultimately triggered widespread unrest. Unrest in the satellite states. The first challenge to Soviet control erupted in East Berlin in 1953, spreading quickly across East Germany before being brutally crushed by Soviet tanks. Unrest soon spread to Poland. Workers, particularly in industrial centers, expressed deep frustration over high production quotas, low wages, and the suppression of their Catholic faith. In 1956, workers went on strike, shouting, "Bread and freedom." The Polish People's Army suppressed the uprising, resulting in over 50 deaths. This crisis led to a political shift toward reformist policies. In October 1956, Władysław Gomułka, a formerly purged communist leader, was returned to power. Gomułka, viewed as a moderate, reassured Khrushchev that Poland would remain loyal to the Warsaw Pact. Khrushchev chose not to intervene militarily, and Gomułka's reforms, which included easing censorship and forced collectivization, helped to stabilize the situation. South of Poland, Hungary was ruled by the repressive, hardline Stalinist regime of Matyas Rákosi. The struggling Hungarian economy, burdened by central planning, led to widespread poverty. On the 23rd of October 1956, students and workers in Budapest organized a peaceful demonstration demanding reforms, free elections, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and the return of reformist former Prime Minister Imre Nagy. When security forces opened fire, the protests escalated into an armed rebellion. In a dramatic turn, Soviet forces temporarily withdrew from Budapest on the 30th of October, and Nagy returned to power. Nagy announced radical plans to withdraw Hungary from the Warsaw Pact, establish a multi-party system, and declare the country's neutrality. Alarmed by the potential loss of Hungary, Khrushchev decided to intervene militarily. On the 4th of November, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest and other major cities, decisively crushing the Hungarian Revolution. Thousands were killed, and Nagy was captured and later executed in 1958. Although the United States provided rhetorical support for the uprisings through broadcasts like Radio Free Europe, the new president Dwight D. Eisenhower, supreme Allied commander during World War II, was unwilling to risk direct military escalation with the Soviet Union for fear of nuclear war. This policy left any uprising to be crushed by Soviet forces. Nevertheless, the uprisings led to the Khrushchev Thaw, a period of limited reform and de-Stalinization across the Eastern Bloc to appease the population, which included easing censorship, the Berlin Wall, and the kitchen debate. The problem of Berlin persisted. West Berlin, a capitalist beacon deep inside the Communist German Democratic Republic, GDR, represented prosperity, while East Berlin represented repression. The sharp contrast led to a mass exodus of citizens from east to west. By the late 1952, this brain drain became a critical problem for Khrushchev. The Soviet leader issued an ultimatum to the West to remove their forces from West Berlin and declare it a neutral city. Eisenhower rejected the ultimatum but was open to diplomacy, hosting Khrushchev at Camp David in 1959. This détente led to a planned summit in Paris the following year, but the event collapsed after an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The U-2 incident was seen as a betrayal of the Camp David spirit, and the Berlin issue remained unresolved. In response to the ongoing human exodus, Khrushchev and East German leader Walter Ulbricht took drastic action. On the 13th of August, 1961, East German authorities began the construction of what they called the anti-fascist bulwark, the Berlin Wall. Initially a barbed wire and concrete barrier, the wall was quickly fortified with guard towers, trenches, and armed guards, stretching for over 155 kilometers, 96 miles, to completely encircle West Berlin. Amidst these political tensions, the Eisenhower-Khrushchev era still fostered cultural exchanges. The most famous was the American National Exhibition in Moscow in 1959, showcasing American consumer goods and technology. It is best remembered for the impromptu kitchen debate between Khrushchev and then U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon. The debate, conducted within a model American kitchen, touched on the merits of capitalism versus communism, the Sino-Soviet split, and the Third World. While tensions eased slightly with the West, relations between the Soviet Union and its largest communist ally, China, began to deteriorate. Mao Zedong viewed Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies as an attack on core communist principles, fearing that the criticism of Stalin was a veiled threat to his own regime. This fear of revisionism led to an ideological rupture. The Soviets refused to aid the PRC in its goal of capturing Taiwan, further fueling the rift. At the 22nd Party Congress in 1961, Khrushchev criticized regimes that remained too radical and unwilling to embrace peaceful coexistence. This marked the culmination of the ideological rupture known as the Sino-Soviet split. Albania, a founding member of the Warsaw Pact, broke from the Soviet Union to align with China, as Mao believed China was better suited to lead the global communist movement after Stalin's death. A large number of nations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East gained independence from colonial rule after World War II. These countries chose not to align formally with the First World Western Capitalist Bloc or the Second World Eastern Communist Bloc. This concept of non-alignment was promoted at the Bandung Conference in 1955 and formally established at the Belgrade Conference in 1961 Yugoslavia. The movement's principal founders included Tito of Yugoslavia, Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Sukarno of Indonesia. These developing nations, not tied to either major bloc, became known collectively as the Third World. Crisis in Cuba. While the United States supported many anti-communist regimes in Latin America, a communist government suddenly emerged in what Americans regarded as their own backyard, Cuba. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista, a former Cuban president, staged a military coup, installing himself as a dictator. Batista aligned closely with the U.S., and American corporations dominated the Cuban economy. Opposition grew among students, intellectuals, and the rural poor. Fidel Castro, a young lawyer and activist, became the most prominent leader of the anti-Batista movement. After an unsuccessful attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953, Castro gained national prominence. At this stage, his movement was primarily motivated by nationalism and the desire for social and economic reform, not communism. In 1956, Castro and a small group of revolutionaries, including Che Guevara, returned from exile and began a guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. As Batista's regime grew increasingly unpopular due to corruption and brutality, Castro's 26th of July movement grew rapidly. On the 1st of January 1959, Batista was forced to flee Cuba, and Castro and his guerrilla forces entered Havana within days, seizing full control. Initially, the U.S. recognized the new government. However, Castro quickly nationalized U.S. assets in Cuba and signed trade agreements with the Soviet Union. By 1961, Castro publicly declared himself a Marxist-Leninist. The administrations of President Dwight D. Eisenhower and later John F. Kennedy viewed the presence of a communist government just 90 miles off the coast of Florida as a severe security threat. The Kennedy administration launched the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, a clandestine effort using CIA-trained Cuban exiles. The landing failed disastrously, strengthening Castro's position and prompting him to seek firm military protection from the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis. In response to the U.S. threat, in 1962, the Soviet Union secretly began deploying medium-range, nuclear-capable ballistic missiles to Cuba. When U.S. U-2 spy planes discovered the missile sites in October 1962, the world entered the most severe nuclear crisis in history. President Kennedy announced a naval quarantine, he called it a blockade, around Cuba to prevent Soviet ships from delivering more military equipment. He demanded that Khrushchev remove the already deployed missiles. During the 13 days of intense tension, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was ultimately resolved through secret diplomacy. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw all missiles from Cuba. In return, Kennedy publicly pledged never to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to withdraw U.S. Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey. The resolution helped to ease tensions, leading to the establishment of a hotline, a direct communication link between Moscow and Washington. IV. The Vietnam quagmire and détente 1964-1979. Escalation in Vietnam. Following the French defeat, the U.S. viewed South Vietnam as a crucial frontline state in its containment strategy. President Kennedy stepped up economic and military aid to the regime of No Dinh Diem and sent thousands of U.S. military advisors. However, Diem's authoritarian and corrupt rule, coupled with the repression of Buddhists, increased support for the communists. After Diem's assassination in 1963, the political situation in South Vietnam became chaotic. In the summer of 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident provided President Lyndon B. Johnson with the justification for military escalation. The U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the president to use large-scale military force without a formal declaration of war. The U.S. began the bombing campaign against North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder, and deployed large-scale ground combat units in 1965. The war quickly became a devastating war of attrition. U.S. forces relied on superior firepower and air superiority to fight the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, who used sophisticated guerrilla tactics and tunnel systems. The Tet Offensive 1968. The Communists' massive and surprising attack on major cities in South Vietnam was a military failure, but inflicted a psychological shock in the U.S. It undermined public confidence in the government's assertion that victory was near, drastically increasing the anti-war movement at home. President Johnson, weakened by the anti-war movement and the stalemated war, decided not to seek re-election in 1968, the age of détente. With Richard Nixon taking office in 1969, the Cold War entered a new phase, called détente, a relaxation of tensions. The goal was to reduce friction and improve diplomatic relations with communist rivals while seeking a peace with honor exit from Vietnam. Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, was the primary architect of this policy. Opening to China 1972, capitalizing on the Sino-Soviet split, Nixon made a historic visit to Beijing. This move not only paved the way for normalizing U.S.-China relations, but also created a complex diplomatic triangle, putting pressure on the Soviet Union, SALTI, Treaty 1972. Immediately following the China visit, Nixon traveled to Moscow to sign the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALTI, with Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev. This was the first agreement to place limits on the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, held by both superpowers. Helsinki Accords, 1975. Signed by 35 nations, this accord recognized the post-war boundaries in Europe, including the recognition of East Germany, and established principles of human rights that the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc agreed to uphold, a provision later used by the West to exert pressure. End of the Vietnam War and the fall of Saigon. In parallel with détente, Nixon implemented the policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing U.S. troops and shifting the responsibility for combat to the South Vietnamese Army. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, leading to the withdrawal of the last U.S. combat troops. However, the fighting quickly resumed. Without direct U.S. military intervention, North Vietnam launched a major offensive in 1975. Saigon fell on the 30th of April, 1975, marking the end of the Vietnam War and the unification of the country under communist rule. The U.S. defeat in Vietnam weakened morale and caused a period of Vietnam syndrome regarding foreign military and diplomatic intervention. A second Cold War and the Endgame, 1979, 1991. The Second Cold War. The period of détente abruptly ended in the late 1970s due to a series of events. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. To prop up a struggling communist regime, the Soviet Union sent troops into Afghanistan. U.S. President Jimmy Carter reacted by imposing a grain embargo on the Soviet Union and boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics. This invasion shattered U.S.-Soviet relations and is widely seen as the beginning of the Second Cold War. The Evil Empire. The election of Ronald Reagan as U.S. President in 1980 marked a decisive shift in U.S. strategy. Reagan called the Soviet Union the Evil Empire and abandoned détente for a strategy of military, economic, and ideological confrontation. Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Reagan announced the SDI program, often dubbed Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system. Though its feasibility was questionable, it forced the Soviet Union to attempt to compete in a high-tech arms race it could not afford. Solidarity and internal pressure. Internal pressure on communism in Eastern Europe mounted. In 1980, an independent trade union movement called Solidarity, led by electrician Lech Wałęsa, emerged in Poland. Supported by the Catholic Church and Pope John Paul II, Solidarity became a massive political movement challenging communist rule. Although the Polish communist government imposed martial law and suppressed the movement in 1981, Solidarity's existence severely weakened Moscow's authority. The turning point. Gorbachev's reforms. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Recognizing the deep economic stagnation and the need to reform the system, Gorbachev introduced two revolutionary policies: glasnost, openness, allowing freedom of speech, political transparency, and criticism of the regime; perestroika, restructuring, economic reforms, allowing limited market elements and decentralization in the command economy. Most importantly, Gorbachev repudiated the Brezhnev Doctrine, the principle, allowing the Soviet Union to intervene militarily in satellite states, announcing a policy of non-intervention. The collapse of the Wall and the Eastern Bloc. Gorbachev's refusal to intervene militarily was the signal for the Eastern European nations. Peaceful revolutions, often called the Autumn of Nations, swept through the bloc in 1989. Poland and Hungary pioneered the transition through semi-free elections. East Germany. After Hungary opened its border with Austria, thousands of East Germans fled to the west. To appease massive protests, the East German government unexpectedly announced that citizens could pass through the border. On the night of the 9th of November 1989, people flooded the Berlin Wall, beginning to tear it down by hand. The fall of the wall was the most powerful symbol of the Cold War's end in Europe. The final dissolution of the USSR. After the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, attention turned to the Soviet Union itself. German reunification. 1990. East and West Germany formally reunified into a single nation, the Federal Republic of Germany, in October 1990. Failed coup. 1991. Hardline communist members attempted a coup against Gorbachev. Though the coup failed due to mass resistance led by Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian SFSR, it drastically weakened the authority of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Secession of republics. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, declared independence, and other Soviet republics quickly followed suit. On the 25th of December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The next day, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin, and the Cold War was over. And that's all for today's journey through history and language. If these stories touched your heart, remember, every time you learn a new word, you're keeping a piece of history alive. So keep listening, keep feeling, and keep discovering the world through English. Thank you for staying with us until now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because next time, we'll travel even deeper into the past together. Until then, take care, keep learning, and never stop exploring the story of humanity.